Bill talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there's not a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem, whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, call our office, visit our website, and get a hold of Dan. If you don't have a tax problem, then your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. And the first one I want to talk about is the Senate No Tax on Tips Act, which is unanimously passed 100-1. I saw it on a meme, and I thought I was getting memed on, because like 100-1, that does, or 100-0, I should say. 100-0, right. Unanimously 100-0. That's not possible. That's not humanly possible, is it? So like, did this really happen?
Well, it did happen, and I'm with you. My first reaction was, this can't be real. How can the Senate no tax on tips bill have passed with every single Democrat voting for the bill? I never believed in a minute that would happen. And as a matter of fact, as you and I talked through this, we decided that this was basically just a ceremonial act by the Senate anyway, because the fact is that the No Tax on Tips Act passed by the Senate is not the same provision that has been going through the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has also a no tax on tips as part of its big, beautiful bill that has been going through the Trump tax law, the big, beautiful bill they call it. And that's got a no tax on tip provision also, but the terms are different from what the Senate did. So what the Senate did in passing that standalone act has nothing to do with what the final bill is going to be coming out of Congress that President Trump no doubt will sign once it gets to his office.
What would be the purpose of passing a standalone tax act, and especially one that goes just that they shove through that nobody votes against? I mean, this has to be some, like you said, it has to be some symbolic thing because they know it's dead on arrival. How does that?
Well, it's possibly dead on arrival. That could be why they're doing it. It could be that the Republicans are putting a lot of pressure on Democrats to do something that makes a lot of sense, at least insofar as the thinking of the middle class taxpayer is concerned. No tax on tips is a very, very positive idea for people. It resonates with people. It resonated during the campaign. People have continued to push for this idea of no tax on tips. Of course, the Republican House and Senate members have gotten behind this idea that we shouldn't be taxing the tips of hardworking Americans. And the same argument is being made with the overtime stuff. Why would we ever tax the overtime of hardworking Americans? And so they have that real gung-ho populist type attitude with respect to the bill. So it's possible that the Republicans were just trying to flesh out the Democrats and get them to make a stand on this thing that has such resonance with Jane and Joe American, and to force them into the issue. Of course, that has never bothered Democrats in the past. You know, there was Democrats, just for example, it was Democrats that are responsible for taxing Social Security. Social Security was never taxed until 1979. The Jimmy Carter administration is what pushed it, and the Democrats in Congress are what pushed it. It was the Clinton administration that increased the taxes on Social Security in the 1990s, 94, 95, somewhere in there. So a Democrat president, supported by Democrats in the House and the Senate, are responsible for increasing the taxes on Social Security. So it's not like Democrats are afraid to raise taxes. They aren't. That's what they're all about. But somehow 100% of the Democrats got behind this bill, along with the Republicans. And I think ultimately it probably is because they knew it wasn't going to end up in the final legislation anyway, and it isn't going to. Now, that's not to say that there isn't going to be some provision in the final legislation that limits tax on Social Security benefits. The legislation that passed the House earlier this week does in fact have a provision not taxing tips and overtime, but it's different from what the Senate passed.
So essentially the Senate has to go ahead and pass it a second time now that the big, beautiful tax bill has passed the House.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Remember, and this is true, it's a constitutional requirement that bills with respect to revenue must originate in the House of Representatives. So any bill that has anything to do with revenue, whether it's taxing or spending, has to originate in the House of Representatives, right? That's a constitutional provision that's never been changed. So that's the way it has to be. The Senate can pass anything it wants, but if the bill doesn't originate in the House of Representatives and then go to the Senate for its review and approval and so on, it just doesn't mean anything.
I see. So what they could get away with is saying, hey, look at what we passed in the Senate. And then in a second, they get actual legislation that means something. They can veto, shut it down, vote no, and get away with it by saying, well, we already passed this.
Well, yeah, veto wouldn't be the right word because that's what the president does. Of course. But shut it down, amend it, stall it, sandbag it. They can do all those things.
Mm-hmm. So does this mean that they have to somehow bring these two bills to committee to come up with some kind of compromise between them?
Yeah, that's done in what's called a conference committee, Josh. So what happens is the House of Representatives passes its version of the bill. In this case, the big beautiful bill.
Pause.
Right?
Pause. Is it really called the big beautiful tax bill? Is that really what they called it?
That's the name of it. I'm reading right here out of the bill summary. This is HR 1. All right, the House of Representatives reconciliation package. That's what it is, and it's called One Big Beautiful Bill. That's what it's called. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, HR 1. That is absolutely what it's called.
Amazing.
This is not. You can't even make this stuff up. You can't even make it up. Usually they use some ridiculous acronym to, like the CARES Act, for example.
They're running out of creativity. They've scraped the bottom of the barrel for ideas.
It's really quite unbelievable. But anyway, just to answer your question, so a bill with respect to revenue originates in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives works that bill through committee, and then out comes the final bill. The House then votes on the bill. And in this particular case, now just to show you how odd the Senate action is of passing that particular bill by a vote of 100 to nothing. The House of Representatives bill that just came out of the House was passed 215 to 214. So one vote difference. All right. Obviously, the Democrats are in the minority in the House of Representatives, and so that's exactly what the vote was.
So it was a perfect split between, but yeah, perfect split on the party lines. That's more along the lines of what we expected to see in the Senate, and that's why 100 to 0 just begs the question: what are they trying to pull?
Yeah, exactly. And so now again to your point now, so once the House passes the bill, then that bill is introduced into the Senate, right? Mm-hmm. And so now the Senate can do what it wants to the bill, and they can either pass it as is or they can make amendments. If they make amendments, then it has to go back to a conference committee. And a conference committee is members of both the Senate and the House of Representatives to work out the differences in the two bills. Once the conference committee works out the differences in the two bills so that there is a uniform bill in both the House and the Senate, then the bill goes back to the full House, the full Senate for an up or down vote. And assuming they both pass it, which of course they would do at the point where the conference agrees on all the details, then it goes to the president for signature. So the question is, what is the Senate going to do with the big beautiful bill act that the House of Representatives has now handed off to them? I guarantee you, Josh, they are not going to pass it by a vote of 100 to nothing.
Well, yeah,
that's not happening.
I can't imagine that. We might actually see unanimous votes like that if they could ever admit legislation that is one single topic, like the Senate No Tax on Tips Act was. But I don't believe that that's ever happened in the last 35, 40, maybe.
Well, I don't remember anything that was ever passed by a completely unanimous vote. Certainly not in the House of Representatives. There's too many of them, 435 members basically.
Yeah.
And in the Senate, you got your 100 members, of course.
Right.
But I don't remember anything ever unanimous. I mean, there might have the declaration of war that President Roosevelt asked for on December the 8th, 1941. That might have been unanimous, but I'm not even sure that was. But it's just the Patriot Act that was passed by the House and the Senate, passed by Congress after the 9/11 acts. That certainly wasn't unanimous, even though we had Democrats and Republicans holding hands and swaying on the steps of the Capitol after September 11th. You were too young to remember that, but I certainly remember it vividly. They're all standing on the steps of the Capitol, arm in arm, and swaying to the Star Spangled Banner in America the Beautiful. And now we're all united against this common enemy. Well, even the Patriot Act that was supposed to fight terrorism. We're going to fight terrorism. That wasn't unanimous. So
probably a good thing, because if you've read the Patriot Act, I would have voted no.
There's problems with the Patriot Act, but that's outside the scope of our discussion.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic. All right, so President Trump's skinny budget was released, and he wants to cut the IRS budget by $2.5 billion or $1 million.
It's $1 billion, $2.5 billion. He wants to cut the IRS's budget.
Well, how's that compared to with what Biden did?
Well, Biden went exactly the opposite direction. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2023. That provided $80 billion in supplemental spending, supplemental budget to the Internal Revenue Service on top of its ordinary operating budget. All right, now Congress clawed some of that back, about $20 billion. I think it was the next year Congress clawed some of that back. So they're still talking about $60 billion worth of increased funding to the Internal Revenue Service. Now, this is supplemental funding. So this is on top of the roughly $12.5 billion budget that the IRS has had, every year for the last, 8 years, whatever it's been. 1.5, 1.8, I'm sorry, 12.5, 12.6, 12.8, right in that range. So we're not talking about here cutting the supplemental budget that the Inflation Adjustment Act gave to the IRS, but we are talking about cutting their normal operating budget. So if they cut $2.5 billion out of it, we're talking about roughly $10 billion in annual operating budget to the Internal Revenue Service to fund its operation. Now, this is part of the so-called skinny budget where Biden is looking for, where Trump is looking for cuts across the board in federal government spending. They want cuts in every department. They want cuts in programs to the extent that that's possible. And so Trump has put that pressure on Congress to come up with that. And this is what his budget calls for in terms of the IRS.
There's been claims that the cuts will encourage cheating. What is that based off of?
Well, it's based off the proposition that the only way that you ever can deal with the American public is to grind them into powder when it comes to tax law enforcement. And I have for decades, really for 25 years, I have pounded on both the IRS and Congress on this idea that there's more to be gained by education, outreach, and taxpayer assistance than there is by enforcement. And I base that on this proposition, which is a really simply, very easily documentable fact. And that is 98% of all of the revenue that the IRS collects is collected, quote unquote, voluntarily from taxpayers. And what I mean by voluntarily is that people do what they're supposed to do without the need of IRS intervention, right? The IRS calls that voluntary compliance. So in other words, people file their tax returns and they pay their taxes on time without the need of IRS intervention. 98% of all of the revenue that's collected by the IRS is collected in that manner. Only 2% of federal revenue, we're talking about roughly $5 trillion annually, only 2% of that money is collected through enforcement action. Now, the IRS will tell you at every turn that every time its budget goes down, that tax cheating will go up because the IRS is no longer able to enforce the tax laws. But I just do not believe that's true, and the data does not bear it out, right? And so what I say is that, and I said this when the Inflation Adjustment Act, $80 billion in supplemental spending was passing through Congress. I wrote on this repeatedly, and there's a number of articles that were published by the National Review that I wrote that are available. Go to nationalreview.com, put my name, Dan Pilla, in the search box, and you'll get all my articles there. And go back and look at those articles that I wrote during 2023 and earlier on when this thing was going through, 2022, 2023, when this was going through. I criticized this highly because the fact of the matter is people will comply. The overwhelming majority of people will comply with the law when they know what the requirements are, when they know what they're supposed to do, and compliance is relatively simple. They will comply, right? And so my attitude was, you're misspending on this heavily enforcement loaded budget. And about I forget the numbers exactly, but it was roughly 70% of all of that $80 billion that Congress appropriated to the IRS over that 10-year period of time was focused on enforcement. And I argued that that was a mistake. You have to focus on taxpayer assistance, on outreach, and on education in order to get the most bang for the buck. It's cheaper to educate people on how to comply with the law than it is to grind them into powder when they don't comply with the law. All right, it's just simple math. There's more to be gained by teaching people what to do rather than crucifying them when they don't do what they're supposed to do. So again, I don't think that there is going to be. I think it's a false flag to argue that just because you cut the IRS's budget that you're going to increase tax cheating. I don't think there's a direct connection there at all. I do not believe that. I've never believed that.
A simple fact that if the IRS or the government or Congress or whoever cared about efficiency and simplicity and getting the most money out of the system, they wouldn't have the income tax code. And we've talked about that at length. But
Yeah, we talked about it at that length. And let's just talk about the complication of the tax code. I mean, we've talked about that on this podcast over and over again, and everybody knows, I've said it 1,000 times, how many words are in the tax code, over 4 million, how many times it's been changed. Well, this big, beautiful bill that we're talking about right now, I've got the summary in front of me, Josh. The summary of the bill is 65 pages long. All right. That's the summary. And so when you
oh,
go through the actual bill itself, we're talking about thousands of pages of stuff.
and let me guess, there are no
Hundreds of
page
thousands
numbers.
of words. And this just goes on and on and on. And we've got to stop doing this with our tax code.
And let me guess, there are no page numbers in the bill.
There's page numbers in the summary but it's just, it's maddening dealing with this stuff, trying to go through it and sort it out. It's very maddening.
So the IRS has lost about 20,000 employees since February, and that's just about how many were hired under the Biden enforcement initiative. How is that affecting taxpayer service issues? And do you see problems developing with the taxpayer service?
Well, we've had problems with taxpayer service, Josh, really for the last 10 years. In
For the last 10, for the last 10 years, let's just talk about how they were stuffing tax returns into the ceiling boards. There's always been problems with taxpayer service.
There's always been problems. There's always been problems with taxpayer service, always. But it's been particularly problematic for the last 10 years because this is the period of time when Congress is continuing to heap additional responsibilities on the IRS that go beyond their core responsibility. The core responsibility, of course, is to enforce the tax code. And so the more Congress stirs the pot with these massive bills that we see, and the more Congress heaps additional responsibilities on the IRS that are outside the scope of their main duties, the more difficult it becomes for the IRS to administer basic taxpayer services. They've got to realign their enforcement strategies, their enforcement mechanisms, I should say, and focus more on taxpayer services. Just for example, the appeals office, which is a critical part of problems resolution and case resolution with the IRS. It's a critical part of it because people that are facing tax audit decisions that are wrong or collection issues that are out of control, they've got appeal rights, and their case goes to the Office of Appeals, and the appeals office's written job description is to negotiate a settlement with the taxpayer, and the appeals office, generally speaking, very, very good at coming to some reasonable resolution in these cases. Well, the appeals office over the last probably 60 or let's say 75 days or so has lost about 450 of its 1,750 employees. Well, and a lot of those are appeals officers, right? The ones that actually hear and decide the case. And those appeals officers are the ones that are trained to come to this resolution. So we don't want to be losing appeals officers, and we don't want to be losing experienced appeals officers that know what they're doing. That is problematic. There's no question about that. But again, if the IRS realigns and focuses time, attention, and effort on taxpayer outreach, education, and problems resolution, then we are as taxpayers going to be much better off.
Well, like I said before, if they were at all worried about how well off taxpayers were, they would certainly not have an income tax code. But I think that covers everything for this week. So thanks for watching, taxpayers. Remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. And if you think yours is the exception, then call the office or visit our website to get a hold of Dan here. He can help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
All right, I'm on all the social media outlets. Follow me at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and of course right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representative. And if you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. You will get the help you need. You buy any book at any price point on my website, and you'll get a free consultation directly and personally with me. TaxHelpOnline.com.